put the thing down?
This isn't the lady in the red.
No, that's tomorrow.
Yeah, that.
Maybe, I hope you'll stay. The panel can come up to the front now if you'd like, and while you're getting settled, who in the group kind of agrees with Joe Friday, more or less? Okay. And who more or less agrees? Well, we don't really hear from them, so you can kind of assume the position of the younger folks, and you kind of see things their way. And who kind of thinks, you know, they're both right, they're both wrong, there's room for discussion. I think it seems kind of, there you go, Peter, very good.
There's more gray in the world than that black and white.
Sure, yeah. And do you think that that was a positive intergeneral interaction or a negative one? Do you think it was a positive intergenerational interaction? Who thinks it was a negative one? And I wonder why we kind of all agree that it was a negative interaction. Do any of you have thoughts on why that kind of struck the group as not super positive?
I think we were supposed to think it was positive,
I think so too.
but it felt like I was watching an after-school special.
And why is that?
It felt like a lecture
Mm-hmm.
that the writers of that TV show delivered
For sure.
their children and grandchildren.
I have a lot to say. I'm going to say it on national television, right? Would you react positively if you were given that kind of a lecture, or would you? What do you think?
Probably not.
Yeah. What would you say to Joe Friday and his stoic partner?
I don't know if I would choose to fight that battle.
Sure, that makes sense too.
Because I try to be as respectful as I can to my older peers, I guess, even though that's like a oxymoron, I guess. But I just, when people are that into their mindset about this is the way I see things and this is how things are going to happen and that you can't change the world and blah, blah, blah. I don't think that. And so our ideals are never going to match because I see it one way and he sees it completely opposite.
It's kind of a bucket of cold water on those kids, you know?
Well, let me just say one thing. The fact that Joe Friday had a gun on his hip influences how you're going to react to it.
Sure.
And a discussion in that framework is really not a conversation.
Yeah, the authority is too much. You can't have a sort of on the same level. Well, now that we've broken the ice with a little dragnet, how's about our panelists introduce themselves?
Okay, I'm assuming I'm very posted. My name's Caitlin Hamilton. You can call me Katie. I'm a recent graduate of SUNY Potsdam, 2015, yay. I work at Cuba College. I'm a resident director. I'm new to the area. I'm from Syracuse. And that's my own piece, I guess.
I'm Sarah Krebling, I'm the children's librarian here, and I think I'm Gen X. I think I was born the very last year of Generation X, depending on who you ask.
I'm Stephanie Craig, and I have been a social worker for 34 years, and I am a professor at Civic College in the social work division. And I really liked the clip because I could see a lot of similarities to what we do see today. Maybe the kids were dressed differently, but I could see a lot of the conversation being had at the kids, so to speak. And in a lot of intergenerational conversations, you see conversations being had, whether it be the kids having it at the adults or the adults having it at the kids. And I think a combination of what we're going to discuss tonight is how do we have those communications with each other instead of at each other. You know, so I liked he had the gun on his hip, he had the authority, he was having the conversation at them. You know, so.
The kids didn't seem too excited about having a conversation at that moment.
Yeah.
Well, it might be helpful to go over some definitions of what the different generations are, and Sarah kind of leads into that.
I saw your notes.
Yes, thank you. So what are the generations currently in existence in American culture? And I might ask you guys to identify yourselves, if you identify with any of these, if you want to. we've got the traditionalists, which I have been kind of referred to in my mind as the greatest generation. I think that's sort of a colloquialism for them, but I guess the official term, according to the US Census, is perhaps traditionalists. And those folks, according to this record, I mean, you do see a lot of disagreement on where the dividing lines are, but the traditionalists, born 1925 to 1945, 50 million of them in the United States today, followed by the baby boomers, born 1946 to 1964, and there's a massive 80 million of them. They're followed by Generation X, born 65 to 80, according to this. I'm not sure if, it seems like the closer we get to the present, the more wobbly the lines tend to get. But there are 46 million of those, and it's interesting, that's the smallest of the generations in terms of population, coming right after the largest. And then we have Generation Y / the millennials. These are born in 1981 to 2006, according to this, and there are 76 million of us around. So that's the second largest group. Would any of you want to raise your hand and say, I'm a member of I was born in the traditionalist era?
Well, I was. I didn't consider myself a traditionalist.
Yeah, that's an
There was
interesting.
another term
interesting
that I'd seen for our group, and I don't remember what it was now, but it was a group for just a few years before the baby boomers, but not part of the World War II crowd.
Sure, yeah.
So,
More influenced by those later developments.
Yeah, I'm on the cup. I was 1945.
Sure, yeah. And, yeah, when you're right on the edge like that, how can you define yourself as the same as the person who was born 20 years before that? It's kind of hard. Who would say that they are in the baby boom generation?
Got it by 9 days.
Awesome.
9 days. Yeah, January 9th, 1946.
And who do we have in Generation X? We've got one there. Okay, two of the librarians.
We
in
are
the
the
room.
smallest.
That's true, yes. I wonder if this is going to be borne out right here. And the Generation Y or millennial, that's me. So what does that mean? Well, for traditionalists, and you can jump in if you know of any kind of additional things here, the influences on what made the traditionalists who they are include the Great Depression, the Roaring 20s, that's for the early end, World War I and then World War II, of course, the Korean War, and the GI Bill. And this led to characteristics that include being patriotic, loyal, with a waste not, want not sensibility. They tend to have faith in institutions. They have one company type careers, and a military influenced top-down approach. And the key word for them is loyal. For the baby boomers, they were influenced by suburbia, TV, you can see differences emerging already, Vietnam and Watergate, protests, the human rights movement, and drugs and rock and roll. I'll notice that they left off one key term on this particular site. Characteristics.
Like civil rights.
True, that, yeah. The characteristics of the baby boomers are idealism, competitiveness, and the questioning of authority. Very interesting. And the key word for them is optimist. I don't know if anybody feel like that kind of describes their take on the baby boomer generation. Does that fit? Yeah. Generation X, and I've seen this referred to as the generation that kind of got the shaft. I'm not sure why, maybe we can discuss that. The influences on Generation X include Sesame Street and MTV, Game Boy and the PC, the tripling of the divorce rate, and latchkey children. Their characteristics include eclectic, resourceful, self-reliant, distrustful of institutions, and highly adaptive to change in technology. And their keyword, interestingly enough, is skepticism. Does that fit any of the Generation Xers in the room? Angela says no comment.
Look out behind you, Angela. I've heard that the skepticism is related to TV, which is interesting because you said TV was a baby boomer influence, but I've heard that my generation watched so much TV,
Oh my
saw
God.
so many commercials that we just became skeptical of everything and see it as a sales
Oh,
Makes
totally.
sense. And for Generation Y, or the millennials, influences include expanded technology, natural disasters, violence, gangs, and diversity. And our characteristics include globally concerned, realistic, cyber literate, And this is another one. Personal safety is our number one concern. And our keyword is realistic. So those are some of the definitions of the generational characteristics. Do people think that those are fairly accurate? What do you guys think? Does that fit the bill? Yeah.
How do you characterize a generation? I mean, who made that characterization? Because I can relate to some of it, but I can relate 180 degrees away from some of it.
For sure. Yeah. Do you have any insight into that?
Well, I think it's usually done by the sociologists. You know, they look at society after, and they look at just different trends. You know, I'm not a sociologist, but, you know, Jessica were here, she would tell us and add that to us. Sociologists of society and looking at trends.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is odd about that is there are lots of gangs before the Bloods and the Crips. You know, the Godfather and, you know.
Yeah, I found that odd too.
And gangs were quite important for periods much earlier than the period that's referred to here as the period of gangs.
Yeah. And I wonder if the difference is, again, that televised nature of everything, taking it from, you know, well, probably would have been limited to certain geographic locations, but the wider awareness of it through both the politicians decrying it and showing up in pop culture and things of that nature, whereas maybe there was a certain, I don't know, but perhaps it was something that was more insulated against in earlier generations, and the sociologists determined it to be more of a factor in the development of thought processes later on. I don't know, that is interesting though, because I don't, you know, as supposedly my generation, I don't know that I've been particularly influenced by that particular, it does feel like something that's just kind of always been there, so.
I think the interesting thing about gangs is the type of gangs. You know, in the, as you're referring to, previous, you know, gangs from many, many years ago, there was that commune, you know, that real community sense of a gang where they met a lot of familial need, you know, where you didn't necessarily have, you know, a family, where that gang kind of also met that familial need.
And
Whereas
we did that in the 70s as well.
Yeah. Whereas now, a lot of gangs have to do with getting a drug. They have to do with turfs. They don't necessarily, there are gangs that do still meet the familial need, but there are many other type of gangs today. There's like turfist gangs, conflict gangs. There's, you know, gangs that just go for doing criminal activities. So there's a lot more types of gangs today. Whereas, you know, there was a community of gangs in the 60s, 70s that really met a lot of community need. There was a social need and a family type of need, which is, I think, a very different type of gang personality than there is today. Do you think it's belonging? I'm sorry.
I just think that can be overblown. I mean, these turf gangs are providing protection, which is a familial need. I mean,
Yeah.
A Rotary Club could be a gang.
Yeah, well, yeah.
As a Rotarian.
Right. I guess I'm thinking more of, you know, city gangs, and thinking of the gangs that I'm thinking of that are larger in the younger groups, that are getting reputations. Yeah, that's what
I
I'm
mean,
referring to.
they're not much different than the Hatfields and the McCoys.
That's true.
So with all of these obvious differences, and, you know, it's hard to draw the lines, but I think we can clearly see that there's differences between these different generations. We might agree with some of our predecessors a little more on one day, and maybe some of our successors another day, but there's these essential differences that sociologists and psychologists and folks have attempted to delineate. So then we get to the trouble with when the generations all live and work and play together. So these differences might lead to miscommunication, to problems. So to get at that, I just wonder, what have been your personal experiences on the panel with intergeneral interaction in terms of things like where has it happened? Has it been a successful type of interaction or generally unsuccessful? And how does it happen? Maybe you can jump in on that question.
Go for it, Katie.
Okay. So, being a recent graduate, most of my intergenerational interactions have been in school. And I think, at least in all of the schools that I was in, respect is an expectation. And so I feel like those have always been respectful interactions, and I've learned a lot, and it's never been an issue. But I sort of, where I did find issues is like in the workplace, not so much at Civic College. I have a pretty good working relationship with all of my coworkers, and most of them are older than me because I am fairly young. But when I worked at like a gas station, some of my worst interactions there were with older people. And again, I'm not generalizing, but again, I think back to, you know, all of the horror stories I have from working at a gas station, and they all include, you know, older people screaming at me for making a mistake or not having the coffee done or not selling them alcohol because they don't have a license, sort of things that I can't really control, but sort of felt like it wasn't chalked up to me as a person. It was more because I was young, and that's what it was, and there was no getting around it. You know, I once had a man, so the gas station that I worked at, I had to ID everyone because they like were selling people underage, and so it was like, everybody has to get ID now. And this man who, he came in every day, you know, he was a regular, always bought a 12-pack of Keystone Light. And one day he didn't have his license, and I was like, sir, like, you know that I can't do it. And he literally threw the 12-pack at me and said, I don't know why all you young people they can't just break the rules, blah, blah, blah. You know, he's like, and I was like, I'm doing my job. You know, so that was like an interaction that I had, that I was like, wow, this was really terrible. This older man just screamed at me and threw beer at me. But mostly they're positive.
What generation would you have, if you could guess, that you belong to?
Wait, what are my choices?
So you've got
Alcoholic
traditionalists, baby boomers.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go with like baby boomer generations. He was not a traditionalist. He wasn't that old, but not that you are old. Sorry.
Nice to
Well,
We're all getting older right now.
it's probably safe to say that baby boomer was skeptical of your authority.
Yes,
I would
yes.
say, probably.
Yes, his skepticism came.
I'd like to say something.
Yeah.
I don't buy beer that often, but when I do buy beer, they ask me for my ID at the supermarkets and stuff. So what I usually do, I says, you have to guess my age first. And we have a good time. That's my reaction, a different reaction, the same reaction to that other fella. Geez, you can't tell I'm over 21. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always flattered.
Yeah.
They don't guess my right age, they guess me a lot younger.
I like that. Guess my age first. I'm going to use that.
It's kind of fun.
But what Peter's saying is, you were dialoguing with them, you weren't at them,
Absolutely, yeah.
and that's what broke the ice.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, it'd be a big difference.
I just do it because it's fun.
Right, I know.
But underneath it's, you know, geez, young people should figure out, you know, that I'm over 21.
And dialogues are fun, and we can really focus on the dialogue group. How about you, Sarah? Do you have any thoughts on where and how?
Well, it happens here at the library all the time. So this is sort of an interesting place because everybody comes here. You're rich, you're poor, you're old, you're young. You have a lot, you have nothing. That's like two words and anything. All kinds of people rub up against all other kinds of people here, so it's very interesting to watch the interactions. And I'm the kids librarian, so I'm the wrangler of children here. And a lot of times that means I'm the interface between somebody who thinks the kids are being too loud. Sure, they're being too loud. So I'll have to come down and tell them to quiet down. But one thing that happens a lot is they like to hang out by the front door while they're waiting for their ride. So they're just being kids, they're throwing a football, they're wrestling, they're doing all kinds of stuff. It's, we all did that. It's easy to forget that you were like that when you aren't like that anymore. And it happens to me too. So at first I would just be like, get away from there, get away, you can't be there anymore, get away. And that's only so effective. So finally I decided to be like, could you guys please move? You are scaring the other people. And the reaction I get to that most often is, what do you mean we're not scary? Like last week some kid was like, aren't I handsome? I'm not scaring anybody. And I was like, sure, you're very handsome, but there's a group of you and it's intimidating for people who are not as loud or as boisterous as you are. And I had to explain what boisterous meant. But I find that you can be an authority figure and say, stop doing that. But if you say, would you please stop doing that because X, Y, and Z, that's a lot more effective of a tool than saying, stop doing that because I told you to stop doing that. So to me, it's more interesting to sort of think of it as, I need to try to think like those kids, and I need to try to think like those people who are inevitably older than them who want them to quiet down. Because if I try to think like both of them, I can figure out what their issue is and what their issue is and get them closer together.
Do they respond positively to that, Sarah?
I think they do, but it's also my manner. If I'm like, could you please move, you're scaring the old folks. That makes them laugh, but it also makes them think, because to them they're just hanging out with their friends and having a good time, but they don't realize that they're a big group and they're noisy and that can be scary.
So that is cool because the people do the same thing over there.
Right, yeah. So this is an interesting place because of all those interactions. So I encourage you, if you're here at the library, look around and see what's going on, because people watching is great and it's really great at a library.
Can I just say something?
Sure.
One of the things that strikes me about what you said, some of the things you said, is that I think there are some cultural differences
Sure.
where there's, and this is just my reaction, and maybe it was where I lived or whatever. You said something about we were all kids once and so forth. So my generation and where I came from, we weren't able to do that.
Sure. And that's another thing
That was kind of the reaction.
Well, I kind of want to tag on to that, and that I went to a class on teaching technology to people from different generations. And the main takeaway I got from that was that baby boomers and previous generations were taught that there was only one way to do things. And they were also educated in a system that was designed to make factory workers, people who were cogs. You were all educated the same way, and your individual differences weren't recognized by the system that was educating you. Whereas my generation and the generations that have come after me have been educated radically different. We were taught, we were just given a thing and told to take it apart and put it back together, and whatever way you did it didn't matter as long as you did it and you figured it out. So when you're teaching technology to somebody who is educated differently, you have to take that into your mind. And sorry, my train thought just derailed, but there are many ways to do things on a computer, say, and there's a lot of people who only want to do it one way and they always do it that way, and that's okay, it's just the way they were taught. But if you recognize that, then it's more useful for you to recognize that that's the difference you're operating in.
Well, I have many experiences with many different generations. And being less than 5 feet tall, I get a lot of different ages. Depending on whether I'm working with freshmen or whether I'm taking my senior class to work with folks at Clinton Crest and doing intergenerational work, or whether we're going to Keeper Lake School and working with little kids. But interesting thing for me is sometimes I'm called by my students grandma, which just isn't, I don't even have grandchildren. Yeah, I have grandpuppies, because my son is probably never going to get a But the point I'm trying to make is we're all different generations, to somebody. To somebody I'm older, to somebody I'm younger, and it's about our personalities, and it's about our openness to talk to one another. And what I have found that I do is try to encourage, different generations about learning about the other generations. When we go to Clinton Crest, for example, and do life reviews, and I have our senior class of social workers interview, a life review, and talk with some of the folks there about their lives, I have them talk with them about what toys did you play with? And when they find out, we didn't have toys. We worked. We worked on the farm from the time we were 4 and 6, and we went down to the barn, or we did this. It just opens to them a realization of what the world was like then. And depending on which group are interviewing which groups, it makes a real impression on them about what life was like, whether it be pre-World War II or during World War II, and what happened as far as just even weddings. I mean, just having them talk about the difference in weddings. Yeah, we didn't have a big wedding. We got married. It was just before he went off to war, and we had a quick little wedding, and that's what we did. And when, the young men and the young women are going over there and they're talking about their ideas for a wedding with 12 people and, this big extravagance, just to have them share. So I think personality and being open, to be able to joke and say at the grocery center or the grocery store or the gas station, because the bottom line is everybody's got to be checked today. I mean, you're right. Obviously, you're older than 21. No disrespect meant, but everybody's got to do that now, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, I don't
Don't.
want to be.
Oh,
I don't even write number, it's going to work.
but in any case, I think it's about our attitudes. And it's about our willingness to be intergenerational.
No, I don't write one.
And I think that we need to just keep spreading the message and doing what you're saying. I piggybacked off of you talking about, just understanding and helping those kids understand that, we're scaring them.
A lot of the research and information out there, as I was researching these questions, had to do with intergenerational interaction in the workplace specifically. It seems like a lot of work has been done on that topic. Why do you think that's been such a widely thought about area of study? I mean, it's all articles every which way, how are we going to handle these millennials, or the traditionalists are bumping up against the baby boomers, and how's it going to work? What's your take on that kind of thing, and the preoccupation with it?
Are you aware that they're doing, I just have to jump on this because this is a biggie. Are you aware that they're now interviewing young people socially? That they now have to go through social interviews because of the fact that they are so limited in their social skills because they spend so much time with technology that they don't know how to say, hi, how are you? What's your name?
What do you say you're interviewing for socially? What do you mean? I don't understand.
They're actually trying to have students and young people who are being interviewed, they're asking them social questions like, how are you? What do you do for fun? Just to see if they can answer a question about something social and have a social conversation because they are so limited in their social skills because of their technology. So you pointed me to that question because that is huge research today. They're even doing testing. They're making young people take tests in employment in larger corporations. They actually have to take a social test. It's kind of like, sociology, social science, social work, psychology test, where they have to answer social questions.
Any other thoughts on that particular topic? Does that?
I went to a day-long seminar about, just before we hired you,
Uh-oh.
about intergenerational working together, and it was at the Ramada in Geneva, sorry, in Geneva, and it was all about intergenerational work environments.
Were they concerned about the younger workers coming up in that kind of a way?
Well, they really spent a longer amount of time delineating how each generation works. And it was really entertaining. It was really fascinating. And it reminds you of every day, oh yeah, that's how it works. You know, it's like funny. It's scientific, but you also experience it every day in working styles and styles of learning. How people want to work is totally different in the generation. It's fascinating.
And, when you first brought that up, I thought you were going to go in a slightly different direction, because my awareness right now of the way the selection for work process is changing is a lot more focus on social media and what people have been putting out in the world of their personal life, and employers are kind of taking that. Some employers take that very seriously, and you know, if you got drunk once in college and posted a picture of it, or a friend posted a picture of it, maybe you didn't even have the choice to post the picture, they're saying, well, you are a terrible candidate, we're not even gonna. And so my bias might be coming out because I find that to be grossly unfair. But I can see how the employers of the previous generations would look upon what you're talking about and think, oh gosh, we gotta deal with these kids who can't say hello. And I can see the need to research all that.
And you know, being able to talk to customers.
Right.
Yes.
I have a book I always recommend to people. It's called The Victorian Internet, and it's about the first transatlantic telegraph cable. So when do you think the first online marriage happened? I just preloaded you with this answer. So when do you think the first marriage happened between people who had never met but who communicated? It was like 1905 or whenever they put that cable through. So, you know, people used to panic about pen pals. We have a lady who comes here who used to play chess by mail, and she hated the kid she played with because he was a jerk through the letters, you know? So I often am talking to people from previous generations who have these concerns about social media and the internet and things, but I think the behaviors that they're concerned about have always been with us. They just wear different clothes depending on what the technology is at the time. So this guy is falling, but it's always falling, I guess.
The literature I've read on the social skills issue relates to the way that different generations have been parented. And some of that also has to do with our society, which has progressively become more protective. And so as children are raised in more protective environments, they're less willing to explore and test their world and become more dependent on their employers to take care of their needs as their parents would. So where I've seen the need to teach social skills comes from is also helping to promote millennials, learn how to interact with a broader world than a protected family environment.
Yeah, that's very, very true.
It's true.
I grew up in New Orleans, and as a kid, I'd get on a bike and ride all over the city.
Yeah.
Nobody in New Orleans today would let his kid ride around the city on a bike.
I grew up in Queens, New York. We did the same thing. We rode bicycles, we skated, we played stickball in the street. And, I mean, we kind of did our own thing.
Yeah, that's not anybody's fault other than
No, I'm saying-
to realize
about that. I think that was
what
a
we've
gift.
done as a society to our kids with all of this emphasis on safety.
I agree with you. And then I used to teach a sailing class down here for kids, 8 to 16. And one of my rules was parents can't come. You know, drop the kids off, pick them up after the day going class. A lot of parents were upset about that. And they said the reason is that we're trying to help them to be independent. and have time to learn to be independent and work with other people there for the 8 to 16 generation. And I could see that when you talk about the parental love and caring, it was a little bit overbearing.
And Katie, I'd be curious in your reaction to the literature that I'm reading.
I'm sorry.
I have a sort of a hard time relating to the fact that my generation is antisocial.
Generation is what?
Like antisocial, doesn't have the social skills. I guess because we're talking about upbringing, I sort of, I didn't have very overprotective parents. I sort of had the opposite. So a lot of my upbringing was sort of trial and error. So I have a lot of social skills because I sort of had to do it myself. And I've been on my own since I was 16, so I sort of have had all these adult experiences sort of before a lot of my peers had. So I think that I have a hard time connecting with that because of my personal experiences.
Do you see some of that in your peers though, perhaps?
Yeah, I can understand your point of view that we seem like we don't know how to say hi, how are you? But I think a lot of it comes, we do say hi, how are you to each other, just over our cell phones. And that for us, that is the same as communication. But again, that's where the decline in like telephone calls is happening because we can do everything on the internet and that is our easiest facet to communicate. You know, I can have a conversation with someone on my cell phone face to face, even though I'm not face to face with them. And that, I guess for someone who, you know, has for a long time been able to have that, like most of my generation, I've been able to sit on a computer or sit on my cell phone and have a face-to-face conversation. It's just when you don't have that protection behind you that, okay, I can turn this off now when something goes wrong. I think it makes it nerve-wracking to interact with people who you don't have much in common with. I don't think there's a lack of not wanting to. I think it's that I don't have a way to get out of this situation. And with our generation being always self-protected, that being a characteristic, I think that's why the person-to-person interaction is less common, harder to do, because we are always thinking about protecting ourselves and we don't have that technological barrier that you have when you're using the internet or a cell phone.
Now, see, one of the things, Alex, and I think this is all related, what you were asking was, why is it this way?
Yeah.
Why
is it the
and that was helpful in terms of your experiences, Katie.
Yeah.
What I think some of the answer is, the reason this is all happening is because employers are coming from an existing traditional structure, and they are of a certain age, and that's the structure, and they're trying to figure out how do you cope with this new group. And there is going to be a switch at a certain point. And there are certain jobs where you can say there are young managers, but there are other places that are really struggling with, you know, our traditional management structure is older people. I don't mean real old, but I mean older.
Like even just demographically, there's obviously my generation, we're so small, but that creates a power vacuum. What's going to happen? Is it going to go straight from boomers to millennials?
But I think this is something that's just gonna happen naturally.
Yeah, different kinds of firms, different things are happening. You've got firms that are looking for kids who are very, very good and adapted at internet and so on. And the fact that you have limited social interactions doesn't bother them at all. I've got a good friend who works for Twitter. My guess is they're not looking for people who've got great social interaction skills.
I had a recent experience with, where I think it's come from parents and the experiences like all of us have had as we grew up and so forth, But there were a couple of them recently, and in fact, I had a conversation just before I got here that kind of linked into this. And I was talking with several, they're master's students right now. And one of them, she could not figure out how to handle the deadbolt. And so she turned the deadbolt, stuck the metal out, and slammed it and took the wood off. And then after I showed her how to do it, she'd take it halfway, so it wasn't locked. It was just sitting halfway. So finally I said, now let's do a little lesson in deadbolt. So I showed her how to do a deadbolt. But the conversation just before I came here, I was talking with somebody else who came up with doing handcrafts, doing knitting, doing all kinds of things, doing yoga, doing this. And finally she said, oh, it started with me, with the other one, wanting to unplug a sink. So we can climb under there, and she climbed under there. And the one with the deadbolt problem said, you guys can do everything. You've done everything. I don't know how to do anything. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It doesn't relate really to hiring necessarily. I could.
It speaks to the cultural differences, I suppose.
But it also does take a lot to recognize that you don't know anything.
Yeah.
You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I would like to say that when you talk about companies doing the social test or whatever,
Testing, yeah.
and I think that has a lot to do with what Jim was saying, is that they want them to kind of fit into their social level versus moving to the young people's social level. And I look at that as a difference between being a manager and being a leader. And so a lot of these companies, they want to manage and have you do this. So if your personality doesn't fit, they're willing to change it because they don't have a lot out there. But if they want to be leaders and have you do what you do best, they don't need that social interaction. That's what I look at.
It's interesting though, I'll just share you a little bit about my son. My son is an engineer, a computer engineer, and he works for Siemens. And he's one of these young engineers, can do everything this way on the phone. I mean, if I have a problem, I call him. Lives in Virginia, I'll call him. And he amazes me. But he got his job because he was able to interview socially. And he gets awards because he can communicate with the purveyors and the customers and everybody else, and he can teach people how to do this. And everything that he can do, he can teach other people how to do. So you're right, they become the leaders, they become the teachers, but we have to have places for everybody.
Yeah.
You're right, there's the Twitter people, and I have a nephew who just graduated, I don't want to talk about myself, that's not my point. He just got 2 degrees from MIT and can't find his way out of a bag. And he is all this. But yet, I can't get him to deposit a check. So I mean, there's all different kinds in the world, and all different kinds of millennials, and, and those, and I mean, but yet he can communicate with me like this, and, it's all different kinds, and we need all of them. We need all of them.
And moving away from the work sphere, since that kind of bridges a little bit, what other spheres are there in our world today, where we can see the value in intergenerational interaction? Can you think of any where the coming together of different generations would be of benefit to us other than the workplace?
I think you've got one.
Well, I have 2 things. The first is, did you ever look up that article about the daycare center in the retirement home?
That's where I was at.
Yeah,
We had that conversation.
That sounds amazing. I think we should do that all the time. But Cindy came. We had a class at the elementary school, which actually was a multi-age classroom. They had to do service, and they wanted to read to older people. So the teacher came to me and said, how do we make this happen? So we made it happen. And it was adorable. It was so cute. So what was your experience in that group?
So I was the older one, right?
Yeah.
No, it was great. They were showing off their skills, and I think as being on the older end, it's like you want to encourage the younger ones especially with the reading, it's like if it's something that I value, and I see a youngster finding their way and being very proud of themselves, it's, it's great to applaud those kind of energies.
So you went away with a positive feeling.
Oh,
And
definitely.
the kids get to have a
It's
positive
fun.
interaction. They may not have an older adult in their home, even a parent in their home who's a positive interaction. And one of the things we talk about a lot in the library world is that there's different kinds of literacy. And visual literacy is very important. And I can't even count the number of people I've heard say, don't read that graphic novel, that's not a real book. But if you look at what the skills it takes to interpret what's going on in a picture and in text, and you can't tell me that a kid who's 5 now isn't going to need those skills, because their work life is going to be almost entirely based on visual literacy. Yes, sir.
The most interesting book, not the most interesting, but the unusual book that I own is a Japanese economics book that uses a cartoon approach to teach very sophisticated economic concepts. And I had never seen anything quite like it. But it was, and it was in English, but it's the only book like that I've seen.
And a lot of books are being written that way, so I encourage people to not be hesitant about that.
And cartoon history of the world, cartoon.
Yeah.
There's that whole.
Yeah, there's cartoon Shakespeare. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are books on, graphic novels on the Kennedy assassination, graphic novels on the, 9/11 Commission. They're putting out a great deal of complex information in this format that really appeals naturally to a certain demographic, but if other demographics kind of open their mind to it, it can be extremely beneficial to them too for building those multiple literacies that can be very important. Any other thoughts on, other than the workplace where it's important that we try to promote some intergenerational interaction?
It seems like we're all at the education crossroads here. I took a class in college. I studied theater in college, and I took a class on devising theater, which is basically creating stories from other people's personal lives. And our class was we went to a nursing home every week, twice a week for the whole semester, and then at the end of the semester we took their stories and we put on a show for them at the end. And that was a really cathartic thing for me, especially and for them. So there's this whole notion of end of life review, because it was to a T. My professor had lectured, these people don't think that they've done anything very extraordinary in their lives, and they're going to tell you their life story, and you're going to be like, oh my God, they did everything. And it very much was like that. I got to interview this woman named Mary. I love her. She was so wonderful. She her husband was a pilot, and they went to the rainforest and drove in a Volkswagen on a one-way road, and if you met anyone else, you would die, and all these stories. And that was a really positive interaction that I had that was educational for me, as well as that's something I will never forget. And watching them hear their stories was one of the best things ever, because you're showing them what they have in their life and what they've lived, and it was really positive not only for us and for them. And that's an interaction that I will always cherish, and I know that Mary will always cherish, and the other residents. So I think that education on both ends is really important as well, because in order to bridge these gaps that our generations do have, we have to educate ourselves with the others and on the other side as well.
It's interesting that we can seem to make a fit between our elders, ourselves, and our younger folks. Why can't we make our fit between our 40-year-olds and our 30-year-olds, or our 40-year-olds and our 20-year-olds?
Yeah, that's something I feel like I run up against that in the library a lot, because you have the youth who use the library every single day, you're from birth through 18, and then you have seniors who come here every day, read their paper, do their social activities, come to programs and things. There's that huge gap in the middle where very few come here. There's so much that we can offer each other and to you directly, and It's tough.
Those are also the people who are worrying about the older and the younger.
That's very true.
Those are our caregivers right there.
Yeah.
And I think that that generation in and of itself is so worried about everything that they can do for everybody else, they forget to think about themselves.
Yes, yes.
The same.
Well, not just that, they're in an economy where they're working 2 jobs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, or 3.
Yeah.
But if they retire, we could be a better job.
Yeah. That's also, I think that is also the group that is, they were the group who weren't like, you can go to college, but you don't have to. And so I think now where our world is, if you don't have a college degree, you have to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs. And I think that they are that middle group where the baby boomers, they could graduate high school and go right out into the workforce, and then our generation is the one, our generation is the one where, oh, okay, you have a bachelor's now, you can get a job probably, but get a master's or a PhD. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
This is another way, it seems like Generation X is the shafted generation. Oh, man.
Well, this is really interesting. So I'm involved in a lot of community organizations, and I'm always the only one in my generation at those meetings. So probably those people have, they're having kids, or they've got a bunch of jobs, but it is sort of interesting to see we're the kids of the most socially revolutionary generation.
Yes.
But we can also be very conservative, but we don't commit. Like, we can count on one hand the number of friends my age who are even married, so that's how poorly we can commit.
We kind of touched on this, but we might as well kind of make it more explicit. What are the barriers to all these wonderful interactions? What are the actual causes for the reasons why the boomers and the traditionalists don't talk or interact, or the boomers and Generation X and all over there? Is it simply age? People don't want to talk to people who don't look like them or act like them?
I'm curious about what
Yeah, anybody.
with the group thinks about them too.
I didn't thought about this more than 2 seconds since you said it. But in our family reunion things, some of the people haven't even ever met before, but if they do something together, doesn't matter what it is. It can be chasing around after they're in an area where they find eggs, the chickens later or something, but 2 of them have never met, and just happened to nothing. They went out and one would chase the chicken out of the little goat house, and the other one run in and grab the egg. But they did something, and I'm wondering if that's true of that or not. I mean, I'm not saying it is, but if you did something, whether it's cooking or building or cleaning or doing a project or doing something where you serve together,
And it sounds very easy, but it's not necessarily happening.
Right.
And I wonder why. Is it shyness? I know.
Or time.
Sure.
Or somebody.
I also think this may be an interesting perspective for my generation, so I'm not going to lump us all together. But I think, especially, we talked about the Generation X, lack of communication. I think that for a young person like me, I know I'm going to be where you're going to be someday, but that's sort of like a far off thing for me. I got 40 years, 50 years, until I'm older and, having grandkids and stuff. But I think that for me, I don't want to hear about the bad things that Generation X is going through, because that is a more imminent thing. Those are my parents or my older sister, those people who, are vastly unhappy almost all the time. And that, I know that's a generalization, but that's something that I think my generation is. We don't want to think that we are going to be the generation that is going to be working a 9-to-5 job every day and then going home to our 2.5 kids and the dog and, going to sports on the weekends.
And that dog.
I'm like, oh no, once I have a dog, that will be like the pinnacle of me making an adult life. But I think that, we watched our parents get divorced and all these things. We watched them struggle for money and all these things, and that is a much more imminent thing for us, that we don't want to follow in the same footsteps of those people. And I'm sorry if that was like a little harsh, I wasn't trying to be.
Well, there's a lot of the Joe Friday stuff still going on.
Yeah.
That's the other.
People love to talk smack about millennials and whatever they're calling the people who come after millennials.
Yeah, do they have a name yet?
I saw conflicting reports that, so like we'd be millennials and then Generation Y is what comes after. I don't know.
Okay.
I maybe they haven't quite
It's
decided.
why,
Those H1
and then
level,
you,
I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
why,
yeah, sure, it'll be generation.
I was just gonna say, in my life, when I was young, the principal institution that brought about intergenerational contact was the church.
Yeah.
And as the church falls apart, the institutions fall apart, don't work as well as they once did. I think some of that breakdown is the breakdown of that institution. And I think there are probably other institutions that are breaking that also served in that fashion that perhaps aren't working as well as they once were.
Yeah, I want to talk about institutions, because if you go back to your descriptions, there is a distinction between how the various generations relate to institutions. And I think people talk about the breakdown of institutions, but I think it's a reordering of institutions. You know, the great generation, you know, government was good, you know, and you just assumed it and you followed. And I think as you get to the millennial, you know, I think the Xers, you know, don't really have much use for institutions. You know, it's, I need my work-life balance. Different things matter. The institution isn't the most important thing as it was in the older generations. And then I think you get to the millennials, and your institutions are virtual. I mean, you have those relationships, you have those institutions, you just can't
They're
put
just-
your arms around
yeah.
them. Yeah, you don't see them.
One interesting coda to that is that some of the research I saw finds that the millennial generation is much more religious than the previous couple of generations have been. And I didn't dig too much into that, but I wonder if they're experiencing those religious institutions more on their own terms, or if there's going to be a turnaround at some point in the next couple of decades, and we'll see a return more to those kinds of institutions physically as well.
And I think you can relate that to, you know, the workplace. The workplace is becoming more virtual.
Mhm.
You know, and you can argue, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But, you know, I think some of it's a natural evolution that is driven by technology.
I have a question, I mean,
I'm wondering about definitions of words. We load words so that a gang has a negative connotation. We have a book at home that's about the peanut butter gang. It's about little kids. It's not a bad thing. I think an institution can also be a family. And it was easier years ago to define a family. A family probably was mother, father, probably 8 kids or more, because everyone lived on farms. There were 3 or more generations together. So I think there was this intergenerational mix. So it was the way life was. And it's like each institutional family was an ecosystem. And I know I'm mixing metaphors and science and sociology here. But that ended, or I guess it's all ended, unless you're Mennonite. And I think we as human beings are social, tribal animals. And we're reordering our families. It may be a digital family now, as opposed to brothers and sisters and dogs and cats and cows and chickens. But we still have that need. We still try and put it together.
Yeah, we kind of, we pick our families, we pick our tribes. The millennials are all about fandom, which is an interesting new development where they organize themselves around the pop culture that they most are passionate about. I won't say that every single member of our generation does that, but it's an increasing trend. So you'll be online and you'll be communicating with people, having really intense relationships with people based on a mutual love of what was on the WB last night. And it can be, you know, Doctor Who, Game of Thrones. And it sounds, just describing like that, it sounds superficial, but it really isn't. Like these people organize events together from across the country that come together in Topeka because that's where the convention hall is cheapest, and they meet and they have a great time and they dress up, and it's kind of a wonderful phenomenon in some ways, and in other ways it's like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, but we had druggies.
Sure.
Still do.
Yeah, I think it's
Still do.
What you're having now is a family reunion in Kansas City.
Right.
Yeah. Well, really? I remember reading an article when the TV show Friends was on that it was like, this was the new family, you know, it was a family of choice. Those are the people you chose. So I think that's very indicative of what, like, if I look at my Facebook, I'm not seeing a lot of like weddings and babies. I'm seeing a lot of, we went out and had drinks, or we went out and climbed a mountain, or I went out with my friends and we went to a bookstore. You know, it's your family of choice.
With a picture of the meal.
What's that?
With a picture of the meal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure. That's me.
What's more social than food?
I have a question directed mainly to Sarah, actually, solely as Sarah. And we discussed earlier your role as sort of the mediator between different generations here in the library in terms of behavior. But it goes deeper than that sometimes when you're a librarian, sort of a custodian of knowledge and information. And dealing with an array of ages, you have the youth, you have different strata within the youth, you have, you know, the years go by and what was an adorable 8-year-old becomes a terrible 16-year-old and all this kind of thing. And you got their parents and their grandparents and all these people. Have you ever found yourself to have difficulty as a mediator where you might think, you know, the interest of the child in a certain topic or a certain book is a good thing, but the parent or guardian might see it as a not so good thing? How do you deal with those kinds of tensions?
It comes up every now and then, but as a librarian, I also have a set of cultural values that say that I believe in open access, and also that a child's guardian is the only person who can control their access. So if it's something, if a parent says, is this okay for my kid? I say, I can't decide that for you. You know, you need to read it and decide if it's okay for your family. And most people are like, I have to read that? You know, so if it's important to you, you'll do it and you'll control your child's access. Everybody whose access is controlled always finds a way to do it anyway, which will surprise nobody. The one thing that strikes me is we did a program here on the Hunger Games, and somebody wrote an angry letter to the editor saying, why is the library promoting this book? It's about not valuing life. Why would you promote this? So I went to the high school where they were doing it in their book club, and I said, well, what do you think I should say to these people who don't want you to read this? And the teenagers told me that it was important to them. If by reading that book they could imagine what it would be like to live in a dystopian world that they felt could happen because of the cultural forces around them that make doom seem close, you know, which is a legitimate way to feel when you're always connected to misery around the world, or, you know, you just are very close to that and it feels real and you can read about it instead of having to live it. So to me that means that you can always try to block somebody's access, but they're going to get to it anyway. And also media is an important way to mediate an experience something without ever having to actually go through it. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
Well, I mean, as a librarian, I'm like, go ahead, read it, whatever you want. I can definitely understand parents wanting to keep that thing out of their child's world because it is sad when somebody loses their innocence about it. Sometimes people are ridiculous. Like somebody was like, why does this comic book have somebody smoking in it? I'm like, well, sometimes people smoke. Not around my child. Guess what? It's going to happen. So sometimes people have unreasonable expectations. I'll say that too.
It's interesting, not to make this into a book club about the Hunger Games, but it's interesting that their problem with it was that it showed not valuing life. I would argue that media like that demonstrates the intense value of life because these people are, anyway,
Sure.
that's another conversation.
Yes.
And I also now have a question mostly for Professor Craig, if that's okay. I believe you mentioned to me when we first started communicating that your expertise in particular, an interest of yours, is in grandparents raising children,
Sure.
grandchildren. That's an interesting topic and one that maybe people don't think about too often. Are there any special circumstances or any cultural mores or anything that you can tell us about that relationship that makes it, is it more difficult for those since there's a larger
It's very
generation?
difficult, and I'm sure that you probably will have things to add. Grandparents raising their grandchildren. It's not an unusual phenomenon. It happens a lot, and it happens a lot today. A lot of parents are parenting young. They're having children at 14, 15, 16 years of age. And just by virtue, a lot of times they get into pickles and they get situations where, their children are at preschool level or kindergarten level, and then grandma or grandpa have to step in. Or they do because there might be a threat of removal of the child from the home for child abuse or neglect. I want to say neglect, not getting them what they need as far as food, clothing, shelter, medical care, educational needs. And so I see that a lot and have seen that a lot with grandparents. However, what happens is grandma and grandpa are only so vital after so long, and they get to a point where they can only physically chase the child around. They also encounter this difficulty of the communication with understanding, why is my grandson communicating with this cell phone that I don't understand? And, I'm 65 or 68 and he's 8, and I'm trying to understand his world, and I now have to go to school and talk with his teachers, or, eventually move into putting him into college, and, mom or dad are just like no longer in the picture. Or they take off and they go, or they leave the environment. So, I do see a lot of grandparents, and you see it more and more and more and more and more. And it's not unusual to go into a store and have somebody come up to you and say, oh, is that your grandchild? And you'll see grandma saying, well, yeah, but it's mine, because they're raising the child. And it happens a lot. And I don't know how many of you know, peers that are either helping or have their grandchildren living with them. And you're seeing more and more, we're going back to seeing more and more of this extended family. You mentioned it, I think, seeing extended families and, when we were more of an agricultural society. You're seeing it happen more and more again. However, we're not as much the agricultural society. We're this very eclectic society. But it's happening, and there's just a great deal of complicated communication. And, as you've heard of all of us in our different generations, imagine the traditional, if we use your language, your terms, the traditional with, the 8-year-old who we don't even know what we're calling them yet, and trying to communicate. So I see a lot of that, and support is what we need.
Is there some support in Yates County?
I don't really know. I think there's limited amount of support.
I really want to pop in because.
Please.
Because
I'm
I'm
opening this
in
day.
Family Support Center in both Martinsville and in Midway schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of those situations. And of course, and right now I'm trying to work on getting it into Yates County because it's a fund, you have to get it funded and all that stuff. But the thing that I think was really significant in working with these families and getting their support is the thing that works, I think, for everybody, which is respecting.
Absolutely.
And when we respected the grandparents are doing the speech, they're taking us all. But then we respect the young people, whether they're teens or young or younger, and say, how do you do it? There's 2 or 3, whatever the generations are, how do you do it when you get it right? Because they know when they get it, when things are kind of okay, and they're both excited about it. And then if you ask them some of the things that they really want, the grandparents or parents would like them to listen. The kids want them to listen, and they want to listen.
Well, that's beautiful.
And all that stuff that goes together. I program so well, I think it's a huge bang for the buck. Because I would love to see it come to
That's
Yates
beautiful.
County.
What do you do when you get it right?
Yeah.
You know, and talking positively and respect. I mean, that's what I do.
They know. Again, they'll say, yeah.
2 observations. The first one is, as the United States decided to build the largest prison system in the world, you wind up with a lot of people who are in jail. And grandparents are taking care of the children of their incarcerated kids.
Yes.
And you have an awful lot of that going on in this country.
Yes.
The second one is autobiographical. I was a community organizer up in Rochester in the early 70s. And we were going into one of the public housing authorities. I must have been, 23, 24, something like that. And I met this woman who was probably 26 or 27. And she was already a grandmother. And at that point, I had, I guess, one child that was just an infant. And, I just did a quick mental jump and I said, but, another 14 years, she's going to be a great grandmother. And it was just, she was just on a different rhythm of life, I guess.
And that's what happens. You see, the grandparent just getting in a different rhythm of life and also getting confused.
Yeah.
Because who are their peers anymore to hang out with? They don't have like people to go to soccer games with.
Exactly.
It's not like they can go play bridge because they have to go to the soccer game.
Exactly.
I use bridge. So I don't know. Euchre? I don't know. What are we playing? But you understand what I'm saying, because everything gets very, very confused as far as who your peers are. And when the 8-year-old says, well, my mommy and daddy can't come, my grandma and grandpa are coming, it's just very, confusing. And that generational and that intergenerational interplay that happens has to be recognized. That's part of the reason, I see it all the time, and it has to be recognized in our communities. It's an intergenerational, not phenomenon, it's an intergenerational reality that we're seeing more and more and more because of incarceration, because of teenage pregnancy, because of what we're seeing in our schools, because of a lot of reasons. But it is real.
Yeah, I think what you're identifying is there are going to be societal implications of that.
Yes.
I work with a woman who is caring for her daughter's 2 babies, because her daughter can't do that, and she's exhausted, she lives paycheck to paycheck, and she's
Absolutely.
angry, because this is not how she wanted to spend her older years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the babies, you know, view her as their protector and caretaker, and she had a medical issue, and the 4-year-old said, "Grandma, don't die." You know?
Yeah.
So you really do need to think about those kids
Yeah.
are going to be unparented at an early age.
Absolutely. I didn't go into all of those things, but you're absolutely right. The dynamics, the issues, all of those things surrounding that. But it is a real issue. It's a real issue.
One thing we haven't talked about, but I kind of thought we would, is because people are always saying how people are growing up slowly. But what science says is that brain development continues until 25, 26,
Yes.
even closer to 30. So people may be acting on it, but it's because literally they are, like they're still building those synapses in their brain, and if we understand that, people will be less harsh, I think.
Yes.
One of my children in college a few years ago said, "Dad," he says, "you know, when you were 18, you were developmentally mature." He says, "It's going to take me to 25 or 26." And he learned that in college.
Yes.
But the science checks out, so of course,
Oh, no,
everybody in here
that-
had grandparents who were married when they were 19 or
But that made a lot of sense to me because I looked at my life, you know, at that level, I was much more mature than he was. And so I try to kind of go back and I say, well, what did he learn from us? So that, you know, and a lot of that had to do with independence.
Society was so different.
What?
Society was also so different.
Yeah.
You know, and the pace and so many things
Too.
and expectations. And I
And
think
recognizing difference.
I think values have changed.
And then links into what Jill and Greg said, you know.
We're getting so close to the end of time. It's so, I have so many questions in these discussions, which are awesome. I wish we could spend an hour on all of them. I have double space.
he gave us single space.
So I hope you didn't prepare all of those questions. But I think to close, I think this is actually a question that Peter came up with one about during one of our meetings. And I'd like to know, if you have more than one, that's great. If you just have one, that's fine. But what question, if you had the opportunity, would you ask a member of a generation either before you or after you to better understand their world and how they existed, but might maybe enrich your own understanding of life? And I don't know if you have anything ready to go, but feel free to jump in.
Can we ask the audience too?
Yeah.
Sure.
What do you need?
And is that towards both?
Wherever you're
Everywhere?
going.
Okay.
Because I was thinking of your family. Like, what do you need from somebody to make that doable so you can still do the babies, but you get some respite and stuff? And maybe we need to really think that way.
It's respite.
Respite.
We have a great book up at our club. Sometimes it's grandmas and grandpas.
So,
It's, it's really hard to find a book on custodial grandparents.
Yes.
So you found one.
It was very fun.
Yes, all these books are available for you to check out. There's some great youth-oriented books that Sarah found for us. And we've also got a little list of books available through the Southern Tier Library System on a range of intergenerational topics and understanding the generations.
As an African American, one of the things that stands out to me in terms of any discussion of intergenerational issues is as you get back to the traditionalist group, and to some extent the baby boomers, they lived in an age of official segregation.
Of what?
Of official segregation. I went to segregated schools. I had literally no white friends until college. And all of that frames a lot. And you see this in your political scientists and others who do polls, and you get all these very different kinds of responses from older generations about social topics. a lot of that kind of stuff is framing of the response.
I'm glad you brought that up. That was a whole question we didn't get to.
I was waiting for those statements and those questions, especially for the intergenerational stuff, because I know, just to, I teach multiracial classes, and we talk about the differences in cultures, in intergenerational cultures, and how different it is for different cultures. Because I know that the generational culture that you live by and your culture lives by is just so much stronger in many ways. And I respect that, and I hear that so many times from my students.
Any of those questions come to mind yet?
I think my question, so I think a lot of my generation, and again, I'm generalizing us, but I can because I'm a number, right? I think that my generation is very focused on finding happiness, like personal happiness, and we sort of don't necessarily think that the path that the people before us took is the right way to find the happiness that we're sort of looking for. And I think my question would be, what would you have done differently to find like personal, genuine happiness? Like what would you have done differently in your life? I think that was probably the most beneficial answer that I would like to know without trying to just do it myself.
Any others? Oh, yes.
I think the Vietnam era made a big difference, you know.
What made a big difference?
The Vietnam,
Mm.
I think it's a large difference.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what happens with the kids who were, maybe 3 or 4 when 9/11 happened. What that's gonna be like.
Yeah, that's one of the researches that I found. 9/11 was one of the major.
I'm curious what you mean about Vietnam.
It was such a horrible experience for this country.
Oh, yeah.
I think the way the boys were left, and that we did this, plus it was Kent State, all the shootings, the college kids. That our state troopers, shot them.
Yeah. I was just curious because I just had a Vietnam veteran come into my class today and talk about his experiences. And so when you brought that up, I was curious about your perspective on it. That's why.
I can remember, maybe Peter, do you remember the Cali experience?
Who?
The Cali? It was our servicemen killed in
Oh, the Smiley Massacre.
Vietnam. Yes, the massacre.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was in a demonstration when I was in college. President Johnson had come out to LA, and we took over Wilshire Boulevard and wouldn't let his caravan go where they wanted to go. And the LA police were on horseback beating us, and we wouldn't move. And everybody had, the draft was a reality. Everybody had skin in the game in the way that kids don't have skin in the game with the wars today.
I can give you a personal experience during Vietnam. I had a depressing semester, and I said, Dad, I'm going to join the Army. I'm going to join the Army. And my father said, it's not a good war. So I did not touch that. So that was the previous generation's advice to me, which was good advice. But,
We can have a whole other discussion.
I think we did part 2.
I'm down to your
It's wonderful to hear what you said. I was in the Army and I went to Vietnam. But before I went there, I was stationed at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, suburban Washington, D.C., 1969. And I was trained to fight 2 wars. One was in Vietnam. The other was my own countrymen because of the riots in Washington. Anti-war and the black-white thing. And I've just come to terms with that in the last year or 2. Just a, I don't know how to describe it. I really don't.
Well, I think
So
there's,
we have other stories.
yeah, there's still much to discuss, and maybe we can have part 2 sometime, but I'm going to thank our panel very much. Thank you so much. Thank you all, too. Thanks for supporting this.